And yes, Pirandello's translations in Welsh is the topic of my paper. Faithful interpretation is so difficult, if not impossible. The more talented the artist, the more he sees and expresses things in his own particular way. These are Luigi Pirandello's own words in his essay Illustratori, Attori e Traduttori. And Pirandello himself was certainly a talented writer whose plays conveyed very particular concepts. So interpreting his work would be very difficult, in his opinion, for illustrators, actors, and translators. Pirandello is known for his modernist experimental plays, which challenged theatre audiences. And 3 of his most famous plays have been translated into Welsh. Enrico IV, Così, pare, and Sei personaggi in cerca d'autore. And these will be my focus today. There are 2 types of theatre translation: linguistic translation and translation from page to stage. And Pirandello felt that both alter the very nature of a text, and consequently, dramatists lose control of their work. I'll consider today to what extent Pirandello's fears were realised, and whether the Welsh translations significantly changed his work. I'll consider if the performability of these Pirandellian plays is different in Welsh. Is their performance shaped and altered by the translations? Have the translators impacted Pirandello's plays in Welsh? And should punctuation and register be considered more significant in literary and theatrical translation? The 3 plays were translated during the 20th century, one for a radio broadcast and one for a translation competition in the National Eisteddfod. The 3rd is an anonymously translated manuscript, which is undated, but was found among the papers of a well-known 20th century literary figure, Emyr Humphreys, who directed several translations of European plays. Like many of Pirandello's compositions, identity and insanity are at the heart of these plays. Così, se vi pare focuses on other people's perceptions of our identity. Its characters are curious about the identity of their new neighbour, Signora Ponza. Her husband claims that she is his second wife, while her mother-in-law claims that she is his first, and both accuse the other of being insane. The play is littered with questions and uncertainty, and at its close, we are left none the wiser, as Signora Ponza declares that she is who we believe her to be. Enrico IV is about a nobleman who had an accident during a historical reenactment. He subsequently believes that he really is the Emperor Enrico, and his family and friends decide to indulge his delusion. We discover during the play that he regained his memory some time ago and chose to continue living in his fantasy. And Pirandello's most famous play, probably, Sei personaggi in cerca d'autore, plays with the limitations of performance and the inability of actors and directors to stage a play faithfully. It opens with a rehearsal of one of Pirandello's other plays, Il gioco delle parti. The actor and directors are interrupted by the 6 characters who claim to have an unfinished story and are searching for an author to complete it. The director initially assumes that they're crazy, but as he listens to their story, he encourages them to perform it. The actors also try to perform the story, but their tone and gestures are criticized by the actors. It is not a good performance, in their opinion. Indeed, Sei personaggi embodies Pirandello's opinions about the challenges of staging and translating plays, namely that there's an inevitable gap between the author's words, the translation, and the performance. Actors, illustrators, and translators all translate, in his opinion. They're all faced with a work of art which has already been expressed and created by someone else, and they must transfer that work into a new form. actors will never fully understand the original playwright's intention and cannot interpret and perform the character as the author intended. According to Pirandello, it will never be the same. Perhaps it will be a rough image, more or less similar, but it won't be the same. That character on stage will say the same words as appear in the written play, but it won't be the writer's character, because the actor has recreated him in himself. And the same is true of the translator. Pirandello claims that it's impossible to perform a play as it was composed, for the interpretation of the director, actors, and translator inevitably adapt and alter that which is staged. And he's not alone in holding this view. Academics have explored this concept by studying the performability of a play. Performability refers to how a play can be performed, its mise en scène, and the role of the translator and director in creating this performance. Although the term is difficult to define, it generally considers aspects such as speakability, that is, how easy it is to pronounce the dialogue, and breathability, the ability to speak and breathe naturally. It also encompasses auditory elements like rhythm, emphasis, and speed, elements controlled by syntax, the length of sentences, and the number of syllables. According to Jane Lai, for example, speeding up or slowing expression can alter the audience's reaction to the feel of a performance. So the translator should try to replicate the original patterns so that the actors can convey them faithfully. One linguistic variation that's particularly significant in Welsh translations of plays is the register of the dialogue, since Welsh has a wide range of registers. Register can impact performance in several ways. The formality of the language can convey the nature of the characters' relationships. It can denote the period of a performance, and it can impact the actor's ability to pronounce the dialogue naturally. So the speakability and breathability of that dialogue. According to Susan Bassett-Maguire, the rhythms of oral language are constantly changing and reflect the linguistic patterns of their time. And she suggests that translations should be regularly updated to reflect these linguistic changes and ensure that a contemporary audience can understand them. And this problem is evident in these three Welsh translations. Although only written during the last century, their language has already dated. For example, they make use of very formal verb conjugations like ydw and ydwyf, as opposed to the more familiar yw and ydw. The written form of the negative, oni, is used rather than na, and the formal versions of pronouns and prepositions are used, such as atom, ini, and gydam. Many of these grammatical features would seem unnatural and awkward in a contemporary performance, as they're so uncommon in spoken Welsh today. Another interesting change that reflects the period of the translation is the use of the formal and informal second-person pronouns, ti and chi, in Fel y tybiwch y Mae. In the original, Dina refers to her uncle Laudisi as tu, which is equivalent to ti in Welsh. For example, she tells him, via zietto, calmati, via. But in the Welsh, she uses the formal chi, peidiwch â bod yn groes da chi febythwr. It was more common during the 1950s to refer to older family members as chi, as a sign of respect. So this choice reflects the cultural and linguistic tendencies of the period. However, the use of chi changes the nature of their relationship in the play and creates a distance between Dina and her uncle. And this is reinforced by the translation of zietto, a familiar name that literally means little uncle. Something like ewythwr annwyl, dear uncle, would convey the same closeness and affection, but only my uncle is used in Welsh. These details could affect actors' interpretations as they present the characters to an audience. But the most interesting variation in these translations is the changes in punctuation. How important is punctuation in a translation? Many consider it to be a subordinate aspect of language, just the framework that holds the words together. But punctuation enables the reader to fully understand those words by denoting pauses and emphases, by dividing ideas into sentences and clauses, and by conveying the author's intention. In the context of translation, very little research has considered the significance of punctuation in detail. But the few studies in the field demonstrate that translators should give greater consideration to the impact of punctuation. Like register, punctuation can indicate the period of a text. Research by Rachel May, for example, shows that Shakespearean plays that were updated for contemporary audiences had changes to the punctuation, vocabulary, and spelling to normalize and clarify the language. Similarly, the use of certain punctuation marks can vary from language to language. Lars Wollin points out that the semicolon is rarely used in Swedish, and yet translators to Swedish from other languages often copy it without thinking, without considering the impact on the reader. Unusual punctuation could highlight that the text is a translation, it is different, and alienate the reader from that work. Furthermore, punctuation itself can communicate a lot with the reader. It holds the feeling of a text, conveying tension, excitement, and uncertainty. According to Rachel May, voices, references, and interplay telescope down into a dot, a conjunction, or a parenthesis. The author uses them to manipulate voices and points of view. The reader uses them as points of orientation. The narrator and characters interact along their membranes. And in the case of a play's performability, there are greater implications for punctuation, for it can control rhythm and emphasis and guide actors' interpretations on stage. So what is significant about the punctuation of these translations? They illustrate the translators' interpretations of the original plays, their view of what's natural in Welsh, and their vision of the performances. In general, the Welsh plays read far more quietly than the Italian plays, with less excitement, passion, and uncertainty. And this influences the interactions of the characters and sometimes the central themes of the plays. First of all, in all three translations, there are far fewer exclamation marks than in the originals. Exclamation marks are used very frequently through Pirandello's plays. They punctuate the end of every sentence on several pages, and they convey the energy of Italian and its speakers. They also convey key emotions in the plays, such as shock, anger, and agitation. Here you see one example from Rhianedd and Jewell am awdur, say personaggi. As the father presents the family's story to the director, there's a great deal of passion in the Italian, as they all discuss the importance of the story and of life itself. In the Welsh translation, much of this emotion is lost due to the change in punctuation. Only the stepson is still agitated. In Enrico IV, Bertoldo is cross and disappointed when he realizes that he's prepared to act a part in Enrico's fantasy world by learning about the wrong period of history. But his frustration and Ordulfo's criticism of him are less dramatic in Welsh without the exclamation marks, and the exchange loses some of its humour. Similarly, in Fel y tybiwch â mai, Mrs. Frola is less agitated as she tries to defend her son-in-law's sanity than Signora Frola in the original play. No, listen, he's not crazy, let me speak. in the Italian. The Welsh is less manic and distressed, and we lose the repeated imploration as well as the exclamation marks. No, really, listen, he's not crazy, listen for a minute. Although there are some exceptions, the general pattern across the three translations is to reduce the number of exclamation marks. And this is significant because although they were written by different translators at different points in the 20th century, the same decision to quieten and dampen the plays was made. We should also note that other elements of the translations were not adapted for a Welsh audience. The plays were foreignized. That is, the Welsh translators respected the intention and context of Pirandello's plays, keeping Italian names, the location, and cultural references, such as the Commedia dell'arte, rather than adapting them for the benefit of a Welsh audience. Despite this, the shared decision to adapt the punctuation in Welsh suggests that this was not a personal, individual choice, but rather is indicative of a difference between Italian and Welsh. Welsh appears to be a less dramatic, emphatic, and agitated language than Italian. Interestingly, in Veleta Buchamai, the different punctuation is even more significant than the other translations, because in places it could alter the interpretation of the very essence of the play. As I explained, the play centers upon uncertainty about the identity of Signora Ponsa, and the sanity of Signor Ponsa and Signora Frola. And this uncertainty is reinforced by the frequent use of questions. But in the Welsh translation, many of these are changed to statements. For example, Signora Frola asks her neighbours if she would really leave her daughter with a madman. Although she answers the question with an exclamation, the question itself conveys the uncertainty about her son-in-law's sanity. Excuse me, would I leave my daughter alone with him if I really thought that he were crazy? No. In Welsh, she states clearly, I wouldn't leave my daughter with him if I thought for a minute that he were crazy. There is no doubt in this negative statement. In the same scene, she challenges her neighbours further for considering her to be insane. Now you can see that this monologue is crafted to create a crescendo, starting with short exclamations, then longer sentences, and lastly questions. The pattern creates a particular rhythm. After shouting at them to calm the situation, the long sentences and questions convey the very insanity that she's trying to deny. In Welsh, the monologue is punctuated with full stops throughout, which changes its tone and rhythm. There are no answers to her questions in the Italian. Could she have told everyone the truth? Did she have a choice? The audience must decide in Italian. In the translation, she denies it all with negative statements. I'll translate just the last section for you. I couldn't tell you the real reason. I couldn't tell you what he's telling you, that my daughter died 4 years ago, and that I'm a poor crazy woman who has lost her senses and believed that she was still alive, and that he doesn't want me to see her. Lastly, an important element of punctuation is missing from the title of Così e se vi pare. The brackets around se vi pare, meaning if it appears so to you, emphasizes the uncertainty and doubt at the root of this play. Our perspective controls what we see and believe about the world, but to what extent are things really as they seem? Brackets are used to convey additional information that's not essential. The se vi pare is almost optional and is uncertain in itself. In the Welsh translation, this uncertainty has disappeared. In the Welsh, things are as they seem to you. On the one hand, the changes I've discussed today are very subtle. Yet these changes show the mark of the translators on the plays. The plays are less uncertain, less agitated, and less Italian in nature because of the influence of Welsh. And in a way, therefore, these are no longer Pirandello's plays. As Pirandello himself says of translation, which I will now ironically read to you in translation, it's like transplanting a tree that was grown in another terrain, that only flowered in another climate, in a terrain to which it no longer belongs. In this new climate, it will lose its greenness and its flowers. The greenness and the leaves signify the native words, and the flowers signify the elegant features that are particular to that language, its essential, inimitable harmony. We can see that subtle changes to register and punctuation in translation can alter the performance of a play in significant ways. These Pirandellian trees have grown new leaves in their Welsh terrain, and they've taught us a lot about Pirandello, about translation, and about the Welsh language itself. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was absolutely interesting. So you are saying that all these Welsh translations are normalized and target-oriented, aren't they? Yeah, because the target culture actually expects such changes in the translations.
I think that the target culture, it's interesting because there is a balance between normalizing the language, domesticating the language, and foreignizing the content. And in doing so, it not only adapts it for the target audience, but it intrinsically changes aspects of the play itself. So naturally, the Welsh audience don't have the same experience as the Italian audience, even though that's what normalizing it is attempting to do. And it was surprising to me because as a native speaker, I wouldn't have expected Italian and Welsh to be that different in terms of the level of drama and passion conveyed, which is why it was so surprising to me that there was such a marked difference between them.
Actually, I have the same experience in Hungarian, but we have lots of exclamation marks, and when it's translated into English, they are eliminated always. So, the cultural differences have to be taken into account. So you said it was done by the translator, and I think there was a sort of cultural filter. They had to apply, even if they were not inclined, they had to. And also perhaps since they were, the first was done for a broadcast and the second for the stage, perhaps they were already told that they should do this. So
this is possible, particularly with the play that was performed for the radio broadcast. It was when it was broadcast, it was actually a much shorter version that was broadcast because they had to limit it to an hour-and-a-half performance. So I think that there was a tremendous amount of editing involved in that translation. And I haven't been able to find any drafts yet, but it would be very interesting to see at which stage that intervention took place.
And do you think it's changing in time? Because you said all three were done in the 20th century, but do you think it would be different now? Because we have a different concept of translation?
Yes, thank you. It's an interesting question and something I've been thinking about more recently, because there has been a revival in translations of European plays into Welsh in the last 20 years or so. They were very, very prolific at the beginning of the 20th century, and then there was a lull. And I haven't found any from Italian yet, but I have a feeling that if these plays were to be updated, if there were new translations from Italian, the approach would be very different for a contemporary audience.
Okay. Meanwhile, you got a question. Would Welsh actors not introduce the astonishment, agitation, questioning, and so on in their performance delivery without them being explicit in the script?
Yes, exactly. I think that this is the important part to remember, that this, because it's a translation of a play, the punctuation then has such an impact on the way that the actors would perform it, would read it aloud. And so if they're not expecting the same agitation or astonishment, they will read it differently. They will read it in a more neutral manner than the original Italian reads.
Don't you think that if they got all those punctuation marks, they would feel that it's exaggerated and it's very un-Welsh, and that would also cause a problem to deliver it properly?
I think it could, given how many exclamation marks there are through Pirandello's plays. But it's interesting that that so many of them have been removed. It's not as if there's been a halfway point where the actors are then able to determine which sections are more exciting or more important and dramatic than others. There's almost been an eraser taken to the whole section then. So it's a strange decision, I think, from the translators.
And another thing crossed my mind, that perhaps they will follow the English example, because the English also removed the exclamation marks very, very often.
They do, but interestingly, a number of the English translations I looked at of these plays had kept more exclamation marks than the Welsh.
Funny, yes.
So as you said, with the translations from Hungarian to English, you've seen that they remove a lot of them. I think that they probably removed some, but it went a step further again with the Welsh. So I think it just shows the cultural difference again between the two languages.
It was lovely. Thank you very much.